Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Has it been 6 months already? This week, the one and only Austin Coppock returns to talk us through the major astrological configurations of the first half of 2018. I really enjoyed these regular discussions. They're an excellent opportunity for looking back and looking forward. So let's do just that. So, I say this every 6 months, it seems, Mr. Coppock, but I can't believe it's been 6 months since we spoke. How have you been?
Oh, I've been good. I mean, I've been really busy, but I've been happy with the products of that labor. So that's a sort of satisfaction that I hold in high regard. Those are gems of a certain value.
And we actually met face-to-face in the previous 6 months as well. Another highlight from what seems to be, experientially ever briefer segments of time.
Yeah, that was glorious. We tried to drink all of the rum in LA.
Yeah, and it did an all right job.
If I wasn't holding you back, you may have succeeded.
True, but then...
Well, and to be clear, I wasn't holding Gordon back in the sense of, no, don't do it, bro. I was just not keeping up. So, exactly. Which is saying something.
But then I couldn't keep up with the staying up. The thing about astrologers is they keep drag queen hours, and I like to get to bed before 3 a.m. So I can get up at dawn. That was interesting because when I hear people say that they're night owls, I often I'm cynical about it. I'm like, come on, 2 million years of evolution here. Like you are not a nocturnal animal, but no. You are a nocturnal animal, Austin.
I am. Sometimes I fight that, and sometimes I have to. But the stars aren't going to watch themselves.
That's true.
Or maybe they will, but I want to participate.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's what we're here to talk about. So, amazingly, here we are at the end of 2017. How did we do this year in terms of Earth matching the heavens, predictively and so on? I like the end of your episodes because we get to look back at the various configurations and kind of unpick what they could have been pointing to. So how do you think you went, and how do you think the world went in terms of lining up with configurations that we typically would, that we thought we saw coming?
Yeah, well, I've been, it's the end of the year, which is a busy time for any astrologer, and especially a writing astrologer. And so I've been kind of thinking about what I said and how I framed things. And I would say most happy with the way that I discussed the general tone of 2017 in terms of excessive fire, the sort of spectacle of bright images and loud noises, not necessarily signifying nothing, but leaving a mystery as to what they actually signify. Like the loud, bright, frantic, Chicken Little quality of 2017, I described quite well ahead of time. So as far as generalities go, happy with that.
Yeah. I would say with the smoke component of it, because I remember us talking at the beginning of the year that it's essentially impossible to navigate, and I've been on a couple of end of year shows myself, and on one of them, kind of looking back, 2017 is all conspiracy theory. So you either take the official one, or you take the unofficial one. So it is just smoke. Like that's been the narrative of it. And as you say, that kind of Chicken Little heat. I think you get a 5 out of 5 for that one, Austin.
Well, thank you. And then also, I picked, and if you read my sort of all about 2017 article, the overriding or containing metaphor that I picked was a casino, like a frantic. Casinos are loud and frantic, and it's all about bets. And I picked that in part because of the obscuring smoke and also the obscuring light of excessive fire, right? Where it's like you don't really know what's going on, so you just got to place your bets. I believe we used a shell game metaphor in a previous podcast talking about 2017. And yeah, it definitely, if we look at the stock market and we look at everybody's talking about Bitcoin these days, where people have placed their bets and what they think that means is a big, I don't know, it's sort of a big takeaway at year's end. You can see that casino element really clearly.
And in the case of the US, of course, fire and Las Vegas were fairly, and still are in the case of fire, fairly extreme moments in the news cycle. So fire and casino, if you were to just put, I guess, keywords in a list and tell someone to pick which year fire and casino refers to, they'd pick 2017.
Yeah, that's there's a huge technical analytic component to astrology, but when you spend enough time with the datums, like the actual units of data and facts, you sometimes accidentally will stumble on things that make more sense than you could have possibly gotten from, even being an excellent astrologer technically. So let me tell you, the very first almanac I wrote when I sat down and tried to cover an entire year in a book, which was in late 2010, but it was about 2011. And I had this at the end of it when I was trying to contain it within a vision or an image. I had this idea of the jinn rising up from the desert, but I couldn't make it fit with any of what I thought I knew, and so I nixed it. And then, of course, Arab Spring immediately in 2011. I was like, God damn it!
Yeah. But see, as I was putting the questions together for this episode, that's quite insightful, because in something like remote viewing, for instance, so any kind of discipline associated with prediction, one of the ways that it increases in aggregate accuracy over time is obviously getting the feedback component. So as I was putting together the questions about how we're going to talk about 2017 as it wraps up and we're looking at 2018, it occurs to me that it's actually good exercise. Because you can kind of look back and go, well, this worked and this didn't, and this was quite a good match. And I guess, the difference between starting out and how you kind of present that stuff now. This is, it's not just this show, but it's very useful to look back and go, the motif match was, we give it 5 out of 5. We give this bit 3 out of 5, and you get that aggregate improvement. I certainly do when I look back at the stuff that I expected to happen and have matched. There's a healthy component of there's benefit at the end of looking at where you stuck your neck out and what worked and what didn't.
Yeah. No, you have to look back at forecasts and be like, well, did it rain? Was it moist? Was it dry? And weather was certainly an important component of this year. So I wanted to just touch back a little bit on the big old eclipse.
Yeah. Let's talk the American eclipse and see
that
what
was
happened.
Interesting. Because I noticed that, I was talking about that last year at this time. And then not suddenly, but it seemed sudden to me. Over the summer, everybody was talking about it. It was this huge deal, and it meant this and it meant that. And it, I believe as we discussed about 6 months ago, it definitely meant something, right? Like, I think I said that, sometimes you just need to circle, underline, exclamation point, a particular period of time or an event without necessarily pushing yourself to make interpretations that have more details than you actually have.
Yes. Because I remember this time last year, you described it as a step change. Because it's self-evidently, I think it's fair to say, given his own chart, it did refer to Trump. And you said it doesn't necessarily have to be like, he dies or leaves, but it is a step change in his public functioning. And that's what I stuck to. And I think that's what happened. But sorry, carry on. You go.
Yeah, well, I think as in as in many things, Trump ended up obscuring the idea of Trump ended up obscuring a lot of really important dynamics. He is he's very distracting. But so when I live in a part of the United States now where I basically saw the eclipse. I think it was at about 90% where I am. Very creepy, very strange energy, very interesting. But and I was watching it not only in a literal sense, but I'd been waiting for this thing to hit for all because I wanted to see what was actually going to happen. And immediately, like a day or two following, the skies here became choked with ash, so much that the midday sun was a dim red. And that continued unabated for weeks because everything was on fire. And then on the other side of the not quite the other side, but thousands of miles away, there was destruction by water. And I was looking at that and I was like, boy, that's a little bit more just literal than I expected the Great American Eclipse to be. The natural, it's not that there's no connection between the literal heavens and literal Earth, but it was like, it's a bit literal.
It's kind of on the nose. You think, well, yeah, I would have got the message anyway.
Yeah, and so an eclipse, solar eclipse, acts like a seed, a dark seed, which unpacks itself over the next 6 months. Right, that's how you work with them in astrology. And usually, the first 2 weeks afterwards will give you some obvious version of that. Right, it'll show itself, even though the full implications haven't unpacked themselves into events yet. Right. But anyway, I was watching the extremely literal fallout from the eclipse, and I was like, well, where's the human political cultural layer of this, right? Because sure, people are upset and yelling at each other and unhappy with things, but that's the norm, right? We can't say that's a successful prediction or that's linked to something which happened in August if it had been happening month after month after month, right? And then we got into the how should we say, the meteors began falling from heaven. All of these people in elite positions in America started getting taken down, I would say, maybe not starting with, but at least most visibly with Harvey Weinstein. And, what is an eclipse? What does a big old solar eclipse signify on the political level? It signifies the death or fall of people in kingly positions, right? Yep. And, it's quite natural to think of Donald Trump when you think of that. That's not crazy, but there are other people who are in positions that, who have, how should we say, that have kingly positions, right? Rulership over the territory of a country, whether it's cultural or monetary territory. And again, I feel like the Trump thing, although a valid angle, was obscuring the other kings, so to speak. And it ended up lining up really nicely with, with your middle management removal scenario.
It did. And I still think you can make it about Trump in a way. So my analysis is as follows, that it was that week that Bannon left the White House. So that is a step change in sort of Trump's kingship. Because... Well,
and that's also that's also like the old Babylonian sort of decoy king sacrifice.
Correct. And after that, because if this time last year I said it doesn't have to be his removal or impeachment, it's a step change in what he's here to do will be revealed. And the whole of Q4 and the beginning of Q3, or the end of Q3 rather, has been about completely removing obstacles to getting the tax reform through. And that sort of, and although he tried in May, and it was a sort of half-hearted attempt, and it was like the stars weren't aligned, right? And that didn't go through. And then after the eclipse and after Bannon's gone, it's just been this bulldozing towards tax reform. So the motif, the post eclipse motif, is certainly people falling from kingship, but you can, in a way, if we look back at it, say, well, there was a change. He kind of stopped being, well, he didn't stop being, but the primary kind of Trumpian motif wasn't Bannon-esque anymore. It was this sort of tax reform stuff. So I think, what do you reckon? If we look back at was that the kind of the stars major release for 2017? Was the American eclipse kind of like the big bit of space weather?
Yeah, I think that if we're going to reduce it to one, then that would be the configuration.
Yeah, cool. All right. So, anything else we want to talk about for 2017 before we turn around and look in the other direction?
No, let's proceed towards 2018.
Well, this will be fun.
2017 inevitably will.
Yeah, this will be fun because we haven't really spoken about what's coming up in 2018, so I don't even know. So I'm going to ask in a genuine and personal sense. We'll do what we usually do, and go with the high points for the year. So what to look out for in a really high level over all of 2018, and then we'll kind of smash down into the first half. So what's going to happen, Mr. Coppock?
That's a good question. I certainly have all of the pieces before me, and I will be cooking them into word gumbo over the next couple weeks and putting out some writing on it. But let me start with the most important single piece. And that is the movement of Saturn into Capricorn. That's if we're going to talk about what?
And what do we call that?
Oh, let's see. I believe you referred that as the arrival of the goat god of death.
I did. Anyway, carry on.
Yes, I got a bunch of other working metaphors, but the goat. Yes, what things look like through the goat's creepy hourglass eyes.
And for people who've seen The Witch, which is hopefully everyone, it's Black Phillip.
Yeah, it's quick basic Saturn stuff. Saturn cycle takes 29.5 years. Saturn will be in the same sign on and off for about 3 years, with a total duration of about 2.5 years in that sign. And so we get these little 2.5, 3 year micro eras out of watching Saturn's position. Saturn has been in Sagittarius since 2015. And so it's really Saturn and Sag is 2015, 2016, 2017. And so Saturn is now moving, it's just about to move into Capricorn. It does so on the 19th, according to my time zone. It'll probably be your 20th. And so Saturn will be in Capricorn until 2020, right? So this is the Saturn position that's going to play us out of the decade. Now, a couple things. So one I think it's worth noting is that Saturn being a background to a couple years in a row often kind of sets the tone and pace. And so during Saturn in Sagittarius this time, if you think about...
Perhaps we should have opened the show by saying, hello, Mercury retrograde. This is the first recording dropout I've had all year, maybe. But we shall pick it up. You were talking about, you're saying, think about Saturn in Sagittarius. So from 2015 to now-ish, and what that's like. So back over to you, Mr. Coppock.
Yeah, I was just saying that, it has this frantic, fiery quality. If you think about a horse's lower half, a horse's instincts and reactions, you have the roly-pony eyes, right, where horses get spooked. And, I would say people have been spooked repeatedly over the last 3 years. That's actually been a big thing. And and the racing towards question mark. racing towards something. We're definitely going fast, but what is the destination? Anyway, Saturn on the 19th moves into Capricorn. And Capricorn is often represented as a goat with a fishtail. So maybe not so speedy an animal. Capricorn is one of the signs that Saturn rules. It's one of Saturn's domiciles. And so when a planet is in its domicile, such as Saturn is in Capricorn, it is considered to be fully empowered. The teaching metaphor is usually a ruler in the heart of their own fortress with all of their servants and resources at their disposal. And so when you have a planet that's empowered in such a way, it often it acts. You'll see it by transit or however it's functioning in charts. You'll see it act in a rather unmitigatedly archetypal way. You'll get the Saturn you exactly expect, right? Kind of like slow, intense, grindcore, or not grindcore, but like doom metal Saturn, right? It's not Saturn trying to be fast. And so there's Capricorn is an earth sign, right? And so we have this like Saturn's movement into Capricorn and then presence there gives us this sort of gravity, right? Because there's been and I think a lot of people are ready to yield to gravity because they've just exhausted themselves over the last couple years, right? So many fights, and who won what? I don't know. It seems like the people promoting the fights did a lot better than the contestants in the various conflicts. But anyway, Saturn's movement into Capricorn is, I wish I knew more about music, but it's like dropping an octave, right? And it brings Saturn's significations down to earth and down to the actual facts or state of things, right? There's a little bit of a like calm down and look at where you're really at. In that Capricorn is the sign which in the northern hemisphere is the first of winter, and Saturn is the single planet associated with excessive cold and immobility. One of the metaphors that's caught me is actually the Game of Thrones. Winter is coming.
I was thinking, yeah.
Saturn movement into Capricorn means winter has come, and it's just like in the fantasy series, it's going to be a 3-year winter, right? And winter, and as I explored the winter metaphor, I found a lot of useful things, right? Like winter's not a time of frantic activity. To a certain degree, you will have the fruits of what you did during the summer, what you gathered in the fall. And then there's a certain focus on, defending and maintaining and slowly enriching your position rather than running about looking for something new. If we think about, winter traditionally, winter's not a time where you build new structures, right? You don't break ground when it's frozen, and you also don't necessarily plant a new crop. But you have the pickles and the preserves in your basement, at least in my grandma's basement. And so there's a bit of that. And what's interesting to me, when I think that kind of winter was showing up in the myth, in sort of an entertainment myth that grabbed people, because this is an important winter, right? Saturn goes into Capricorn every 29.5 years. We did it. It was the end of 88 through 91. It was I think it was 59 through 62. It was 29 through 32. We've done this before. And there are certainly winters in a number of regards, but this one is more important because this cycle hooks into the much bigger triplicity cycle, which is the 200-ish year cycle, where we have Jupiter and Saturn will make conjunctions in signs of the same element of the four for about 200 years at a go, right? And so these give us these increments of history to study astrology with. This is mostly from Abu Mushar. And so we're basically like the Earth era, which we've been in since, I think it's 1802, ends right after Saturn in Capricorn, right? And so, if we're talking about Earth eras, right, it's been a time of empire and materialism, right? Materialist, the materialist approach to things, and empire, like literally trying to get all of the material or control of the things. And, we're in the last couple years of that phase. And, if you sit with someone on their deathbed, right, those last moments, you can kind of see the mistakes. The mistakes are clear, right? There will be some regrets. And so we're at the last rites. We're entering this last rites phase, a requiem for the 19th and 20th centuries. And so, Saturn being in an Earth sign pings all of that, right? It concentrates all of that into this next couple years.
I think that's wisely said, that it's because it is an important transition. It has picked up in popular culture because, it's interesting that we're kind of getting a Game of Thrones winter into a eon change, if you will, and people kind of. In that Lovecraftian or even Jungian sense, it's bubbling up in the unconscious. So, because it is that kind of important shift, and what a way to shift eons! A White Walker winter.
Yeah, absolutely. But when I've been thinking about this, and my initial, my mind's initial go-to is. Dark and brutal. I obviously listened to too much metal as a teenager. And then I usually spend enough time with something and kind of find the balancing side. And I was actually, my wife, Kate, just insisted that we get a Christmas tree this year. I've never intentionally done that. I don't, as an astrologer, I have a special annoyance for holidays which have become, unglued from seasonal or cyclical appreciation, and just sort of these free-floating commercial plastic things. Anyway,
you monster! This discussion is over.
Anyway, so Kate's like, no, we got to get a Christmas tree. I was like, all right. And so when you get a tree, you have to cut off the bottom couple inches because that's all sapped up and it won't absorb water. So you got to cut it fresh. So when you put it in the stand, it'll drink the water, right? And so I'm sitting there and I'm cutting, the base of this, and the smell of evergreen sap is just overwhelming, and it's amazing, right? And I was just thinking, I was like, oh, this is the tree that stays green during winter. That means something, right? And that's there's a lesson there. If we can learn from animals, we can learn from trees. I was like, these are the trees that understand winter and that are not whose blooms and whose brightness is not compromised by that. And that seemed like a way into thinking about how to be during winter, right?
Yeah, it's good. Is there an element of, because there's other sort of Saturnine components that I think would make a good match for the sort of, end of the imperial eon and moving into, as I said, I think a year or so, more now, it does line up with when I'm expecting the actual space-faring part of human civilization to become more obvious in a few years' time. But is there a tallying up component to these last few years, to a sort of Saturn in Capricorn, like tallying up in that kind of classic non-emotional way of kind of closing out the books.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at the last couple of years and some of the themes, one great objective concern is the injustices of the last 2 centuries.
See, that's exactly where I'm looking for the positive is in that. So carry on. I think it's very difficult, and this is a positive change, to really talk about anything without looking at the kind of colonial impact. And I view that as positive. I think we're kind of burning off, and it's causing friction with people who aren't maybe emotionally or psychologically there yet. But we are, over the next few years, burning off imperial modes of thought, and I think, and that feels, but burning off is even the wrong temperature for it. It feels more like a closing out of the books, like you actually can't calculate this way anymore.
Yeah, I agree. I think in particular of the short solo show you did for American Thanksgiving, and your question, like, how do we look back, right? What is the proper way to deal with history, right? Do we try to erase what happened when it was terrible? Do we, we certainly don't celebrate the horrors, but we'd also be foolish to forget them. And, the time you spent with that question, I think, was very productive. It was really interesting to listen to. But it also has to do with this closing out the books, this Saturn in Capricorn, as being the last Saturn phase in what is in this case a 220-ish year cycle. So, and one thing I will say about that cycle. So we're moving from Earth to air. The next us moving solidly into that next elemental pair of centuries occurs with a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius right after it leaves Capricorn, right? But what's interesting is that there are 2 different ways of calculating that triplicity shift, and one is is a mathematically ideal version, which is mean conjunctions, which may or may not line up with what we actually see. And so in terms of that mathematically ideal, we moved into this air period in 2000, right? So in a sense, we're already there. It's just that we haven't had the visible conjunction. And so it's like it's already happened, but people can't see it yet.
I have to say, because I was going to jump in when you were using the sitting with someone at their deathbed metaphor. When I had Leslie Keane on the show, she was describing research on ELEs, or end-of-life experiences, because these appear to be the most common, I don't want to use the word paranormal, but we will, paranormal events associated with dying, because over 60% of people have them, and that's when deceased loved ones and guardian angels and however you kind of perceive these things appear in the room, typically the hospital room. But obviously those sitting most of the time can't see it, but the person on the deathbed going through the transition can. So we kind of have an ELE for the eon change, if you will, beginning in 2000 as we pivot, or as we transit or evolve or whatever into it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's, there's Saturn, I said Saturn in Capricorn brings almost cliche Saturn things, like exactly what you would expect. So what does Saturn like? Saturn likes the past. Saturn likes history. Saturn likes deathbed metaphors. Saturn likes heaviness. Saturn likes the jewels and forgotten stories concealed in tombs. Saturn likes the dead. Saturn likes personal responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And so that this looking back and sorting through, and we talked about this before, so I don't want to dwell on it, but if we look at what we're doing culturally, or what a lot of people are doing, it is one, dealing with 19th and 20th century traumas that are still in there like shrapnel, and trying to figure out what to do with them. And then two, looking back and recovering the babies that got thrown out with the bathwater, right? In the rush towards ultimate material science power, which is quite impressive. But we taught, again, a lot of babies were left were left along. It's like not breadcrumbs, but babies in bathwater lining the way to here. And I feel like everybody's pulled backward to do that, or to recover the babies, and to pick out the shrapnel or figure out how to heal around it, or deal with it.
And it has, for me anyway, because I'm quite Saturnine, it has.
Really, Mister? I wrote a history book.
Yeah, it has that slow moving. It's the inevitability of a glacier. When I look at things that people will get quite upset about in a really short news cycle, so something that happens over a 3-day period because they spend too much time on social media. All these things can give you the impression that we're actually backsliding into it getting worse, but we're not. This is just what the closing out of the books looks like. The sort of what I would consider the right side of history wins with the inevitability of a glacier over the next few years. And I find it's really, I love these longer cycles. And that, I think this one is, as you say, it is the story of 2018. We're kind of heading into that closing out of the book several years.
Yeah, and so that's the next 3 years, right? And as sort of as an operational note for people who like to sync the planets with their operations, Saturn will be as strong as you need for anything, anything Saturnian. It's going to be. You're not going to have to be quite as picky about the times that you ask Saturn for a favor or schedule a Saturnian, right? It'll just be, full Saturn.
Saturn on tap. High speed Wi-Fi for free wherever you are. High Saturn speed. Mm-hmm. All the Saturn you could want. All right. What else have we got? If that's the high note of 2018.
That's the baseline.
That's a better way of thinking about it. What other components have we got coming up for next year?
Yeah. So one thing that's worth talking about is that the Eclipse Cycle, which got so much press during 2017, continues through 2018. It's going to be more eclipses in Aquarius and Leo. Eclipses don't come in single events that contain the power of an entire cycle. It takes a while to play out. You get usually at least 3 sets of eclipses in the same pair of signs, basically in the same space before it moves on. And so, the end of January, middle of February, we get another set of eclipses in Aquarius and Leo, and then the same, and then similar over the summer, although the things are kind of starting to slide towards the next cycle over the summer. And so if I'm going to pick out a moment, like a single event in 2018 that raises my eyebrows, it is a late July lunar eclipse. It's a total lunar eclipse, and it is conjoined a retrograde Mars within, I think, less than a degree. And so that point where Mars is retrograde and opposite the sun is the closest and brightest that Mars gets in its 2-year cycle relative to us. And so we're basically going to have a blood moon with Mars at, with the acetylene torch burning at the maximum. That's, and certainly both Mars and a lunar eclipse are indicators of change, not always favorable. So that's one that I've circled, underlined, and put a few exclamation points around.
Not that we wouldn't call this a prediction, but that means that if we were to have a war next year, like a proper one, is that the kind of kickoff point you would say, well, if it was going to be any time next year, it would be then?
Oh yeah. I guess if you told me there's going to be a war, and then asked me when it was, that's certainly an important indicator. But actually, there's a lot of Mars stuff this next year, so let me tell you about it. So Mars will be retrograde for several months during basically the middle of next year, like late Q2, early Q3. And that's Mars is retrograde every other year, so that in and of itself is not a cause for great concern. But Mars's retrogrades are always worth paying attention to because they're often a big pain in the ass on a personal level, even if they end up being empowering in retrospect. But before that, Mars will enter into Capricorn, and so I think for a good chunk of Q2, we have both Mars and Saturn in Capricorn along with Pluto. And Capricorn is the one sign where both Mars and Saturn are extremely powerful. And Mars and Saturn together, are traditionally the two malefics. They're the two bads that do bad together. And so that's, and when you have Mars-Saturn configurations like that, it's often pretty brutal. The last time that Mars and Saturn were in the same sign where one of them had dignity was when Mars and Saturn were both in Scorpio, and that was the Ebola outbreak, right? The 10,000 plus people bleeding to death out of their pores. And also, appropriately scorpionic. But this one will be this period of, it's about a 2-month period of co-presence, where they're in the same sign and, mixing their various significations. And although Mars and Saturn disagree on quite a bit, fucking shit up is something they both agree on. And so that's an intense combination. And that's one martial combination. In some Vedic astrology texts, they say Mars and Saturn getting together form Yama Yoga or Death God Yoga. And then we have that. And so I don't know, when I see that, I see kind of the dark side of cashing out the books, right? And, balancing the ledgers, which is vengeance, wrath. I hopefully we'll find a more positive angle on that, or a positive workable angle. It can be really good if you've got something, if you've got an obstacle which requires one of those gigantic, 10-foot in diameter drills to get through, right? You're not good. There's no way below or around. You just need to drill through that rock. That same density and ferocity that Mars and Saturn together have, which can be very destructive, can also be very constructive if you've got a giant rock to drill through, right? But so there's that, and that's kind of that's during the first half of the year. That big eclipse and the bulk of the Mars retrograde are during the second half of the year, so I'll save that for then. But I did want to mention it. And then we also have Venus's retrograde, sort of transitioning from Q3 to Q4, and it will be the same Venus retrograde that we had in 2010, which is the one that starts in Scorpio and then backtracks into Libra. And so for people who had love life stuff, or just important shifts in their lives during Q4 of 2010, this is a repetition of that cycle.
Gotcha. So the for H1 of next year, it is the main story in that kind of 6-month arc is Saturn and Mars getting together in Capricorn. The villain team together again. Or would you say that's the most important part, or the end of Jan eclipse cycle?
Well, it's interesting. I would say the Mars part is interesting and worth paying attention to because it underlines that Saturn base riff, right? I think if there's one thing to pay attention to and adjust to, it is that we are no longer in Saturn and Sagittarius. It's Saturn and Capricorn time, right? It's winter. Winter has come even if you can't see the snowflakes, right? Mm-hmm. It will be hard to see that winter has come, on the 19th for you down there in the cursed Antipodes. But it's there. it'll be winter. That winter will still be, the snow will still be falling on that level when it's when it's high summer here, right?
It did snow in Tasmania last week. Summer notwithstanding, yeah, quite heavily. So winter's come.
Yeah, and so one way to look at it with a Mars Saturn thing is Mars is going to be, I don't know, adding a shredding guitar line to that Saturn bass line. But the important thing is hear the Saturn bass line, right? Stop dancing to the song that stopped playing, even if it was your jam.
Well, I think Vengeance, when you said Vengeance, that kind of describes it, because closing out the books is, in that Saturnine sense, justice. So this is balanced now, but if you add the Mars component to it, it's balanced with and because of violence. But it's as you say, the bass notes are the things you need to listen to rather than the sick guitar shreds.
Yeah. And just to provide a little bit more context to Vengeance, one of my first intuitive hits on Saturn and Capricorn came a couple months ago. I was watching a documentary about somebody who's in their 20s and rich and had successfully just barely gotten away with a bunch of stuff. And I looked at his chart and I saw that he had Saturn and Capricorn. I was like, "Oh, your return's coming up, buddy." I was like, I don't think you're going to continue to get away with everything. And that made me think immediately of the Johnny Cash song, God's Gonna Cut You Down. Mm-hmm. You can run along for a long time, but sooner or later. And when I looked into Saturn and Capricorn, you see that quite literally. For example, Al Capone was finally imprisoned when Saturn went into Capricorn, as was Pablo Escobar. Right, and those are men who ran along for a long time, right? And then, unfortunately, you also see, as a colleague of mine, Patrick Watson, pointed out, you also Saturn and Capricorn's really big on building prisons, which we certainly don't need more of in America. But there is the punitive, and I would say the punitive and confining side of justice are very much key Saturn significations. And so, what I hope is that we'll get to see, the hammer fall on people who totally deserve it. Yeah. And because when you say vengeance, you worry, immediately you're like, well, what have I done wrong? But it's that will be a theme. And again, that's an every time Saturn and Capricorn theme, but almost all of the Saturn and Cap stuff is just exaggerated because it's this, this end of an era. It has this end of an era thing. Also, because Pluto will be in the same sign as Capricorn, Pluto will be in Capricorn, which is the same sign that Saturn will be in. So you have just a further intensification of these themes.
So that's the big news for the first half of the year. It's kind of the it's the half of the comic book villains in a way. The story focuses on them.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to put it. I would also just say Saturn's movement into Capricorn is the casino shutting down.
Yeah,
right. Whether you know it or not, it's one of, if you've ever been in a restaurant where they're being really polite to you and you don't realize you've overstayed, but one set of lights goes out and then another set of lights go out, and then you notice, the servers are starting to do, their cleanup afterwards, and even though they don't make you leave immediately, there are these sort of progressive signs that it's going out. In terms of the big literal casinos, the monetary ones, it is interesting and worthwhile to note that Saturn's time in Capricorn for the United States has every time the last 3 times in a row has coincided with an economic downturn, although the intensity of them is massively varied. Right.
Gotcha.
One is the Great Depression. One is the late 50s, early 60s recession, which is, most people don't know about because it wasn't that big a deal. It mattered if you were heavily invested at the time. But and then you get the late 80s, early 90s recession as well. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to, just because Saturn's moved into Capricorn doesn't mean that that will happen right away. I think there will be, again, there'll be signs, there'll be like frost on the windows. But we've got Saturn has 3 years to do his Capricorn thing.
Exactly.
And as we know, the old man doesn't hurry himself.
No, that's very true. What else then, as we wind this up? Is there anything else for H1 2018 that you think people need to focus on?
Well, there's the eclipse cycle is of course important.
Yep.
And it's the same eclipse cycle you did this year, so nothing new there. It's Leo and Aquarius.
Does that mean there's another does that mean more celebrities fall from the sky? Is that what we're looking at?
That's a good question. So none of these target America quite so much as the one we had. But if we just to circle back to the beginning and Trump and all of that, I'm as an astrologer, I'm not satisfied with the change in Trump's status as being what the eclipse did. Mm-hmm. This eclipse cycle, whether its installments are seen above the United States or not, every single time going back 100 years, you have something that is obviously very bad for the standing president. They may or may not recover from it. Last 2 times, Clinton got impeached, Reagan got shot, right? Both of them ended up serving out terms, but those are not hidden. And sure, there may be the more important pattern may be hidden behind that, the actual power shift. But and you can keep taking this cycle back, and it'll keep giving you trouble for American presidents, visible trouble, right? So as an astrologer, just him being president it's not that history repeats verbatim every time you get this cycle, but it almost seems to, and so I'm kind of still waiting for whatever it is.
Gotcha. So the impact on Trump specifically was not commensurate with the space weather as far as you're concerned in your professional opinion.
Well, yes, insofar as the precedents for this cycle are concerned, it doesn't match yet.
Gotcha. So does that mean it could be it does that thing where it could be Trump related at the end of Jan or whenever this next one is?
Yeah, I mean, we basically got another year to do this cycle, and there are deviations. Just because if you have something that's 8 times out of 9, that's amazing, and you should look for that. However, it does mean that 1 time out of 9 it doesn't occur. I would just be surprised. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe there are some very bright people who arranged the Babylonian decoy sacrifice appropriately. Yeah. It's a very strange world.
That's true. And if you were to hypothesize that if there are people behind the scenes there that know their man's astrology, if you were to get a puppet of Trump to sacrifice, who else would you pick? Either one of his kids or Bannon is probably closer, given he was sort of lurking in the White House more than they were. So it may have been some skilled astrological magic, or it may just have been a thing that happened.
Yeah. Right. So I don't think so I don't have a specific prediction about that, but that's my take on it.
So if it's not America specific, is it just over an ocean, or where is this January 1 kind of showing up?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't have the visibility for all
Gotcha.
of the eclipses off the top of my head. The big lunar with Mars in July is sort of centered on the Middle East and India, but because it's a total, it's visible sort of 3,000 miles in both directions, sort of centered on Middle East, India. So
But
that
it's like
one.
a Eurasian lunar eclipse, if you will.
Absolutely. It's sort of Eurasian, but south of, not the top, not south
Gotcha.
of Siberia.
South Eurasian.
Yes, South Eurasian.
I like it. Well, I don't like it. I'm glad that we've worked out where that
Yeah, who
one
knows?
lands.
Maybe you'll get. I was going to say your tanker war. It's not that you want a tanker war to be occurring, or that it will be a result of your actions with your boats. But
so if we were to look at how things, the rise and integration of Eurasia is that once in a civilization event, and funnily enough, in a best case scenario, does suit Saturn in Capricorn because it is that tallying up of what has been a 2-century bloody romp by imperial powers through the world island. And so that kind of integration in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and all that kind of stuff can be very Saturnine, assuming it gets over the villainous wobbles. So but unfortunately, history doesn't suggest that peaceable integration spontaneously happens. So if we were looking for the wobbles associated with the rise of Eurasia next year, that would be we'd be looking in July then.
Yeah, definitely. And that eclipse will focus that Mars retrograde story into that region. Mars retrogrades are about rejigging power relations and who's in conflict with who. One really obvious example is when Russia reclaimed or claimed the Crimean Peninsula and all the Ukraine stuff started. They literally, I think it was the Duma, literally voted to reclaim Crimea the day that Mars stationed retrograde in Libra, and so that kicked off this whole Mars in Libra sort of passive aggressive. Dude, I'm not warring. You're the one who's warring. Right,
Yeah,
stop
gotcha.
having troops there. I don't have any troops there. Right, that Mars and Libra thing.
Gotcha.
And so it's they're not always that obvious, but that changed power relations for the next.
It would be interesting. This is another one that you can be forgiven for not having on hand, but it would be interesting to see when the sort of Sykes-Picot map was drawn up by Churchill and others of the Middle East and South Asia, because.
So you're going to love this. I've looked at that. I used to have it hanging up on my wall, but then I moved and I haven't put it back up. So there's one star which features most prominently in it, and that is Kaput Algol, literally the cutting off the head.
Gotcha. All right. So we should look at So the
right?
the summer is like that story. Interesting. Cool. Well, I feel like that's a lot for the first half. I mean, that's the beginning of the second half. But I feel like it's going to be an interesting H1.
Yeah. So I just want to add, I think, one thing that's useful for general framing. Whereas 2017 had this overwhelmingly obnoxiously fiery quality, right? Smoke and fire. There's not the same super strong elemental bias this year. Saturn and Capricorn, very earthy all year. Jupiter and Scorpio, watery. The Mercury retrogrades will be in fire signs. It's not quite the same. You don't have it will be earthier than 2017, by contrast, but you don't have one of the elemental qualities dominating. And I'm glad that I said that, because that made me remember something I would be remiss if I did not mention for the first half of the year. And that is Uranus's entrance into Taurus. So when you're talking about speed of cycles, right? Saturn is the slowest planet visible to the naked eye, right? But we can go further out. We know that our solar system has other organs, and so Uranus is the next one out. Uranus is in a sign for about 7 years. It's got an 84-year cycle, so it's slow. But Uranus speaks to, it's in many ways the opposite of Saturn, whereas Saturn sort of entrenches and fortifies and pressure tests. Uranus shakes things up wherever it goes, right? It's the shaking things up so that the fault lines, it's the accumulation of invisible power or potential energy like you have with an earthquake that gets expressed in a single moment,
and in
right?
this
Uranus
case, it's literally a bull in a china shop.
Yeah, so we've had Uranus in Aries since the initial ingress was 2010, and then it jumped back into Pisces. And then Uranus went into Aries, and in 2011, early 2011, that was a big part astrologically of kicking off the Arab Spring. That was also, I think, within 24 hours of the Fukushima incident, right? We have Uranus moving into not so bashful Aries. Uranus in Aries has been good for protests, for upgrades to military hardware. That's when.
But also, I would say it's
drone war.
Yeah, the drone warfare and ISIS, which because you've got that sort of surprise bitch planet and war, and all is not what it seems with things like ISIS, but Russia just declared total victory over them last week or the week before. So that kind of surprise and war god stuff is moving into a different phase, if that makes sense. Not that this ends terrorism, but like that was the kind of conflict motif, right? Well,
yeah, the story was, like martial resistance against oppressive structures.
Yeah.
Right. For a lot of countries, right? Like, we had, for a while there was a revolution happening. Most of the places in the Middle East, we had, whatever you want to call Ukraine, Thailand had their thing. It was just everywhere. It's that, Uranus in Aries is very like, on a personal level, it's very like nothing should stand between me and the sovereignty, which is my birthright. Right. And it was like, no, fuck you. And so that worked out a certain way nationally and politically, et cetera, et cetera. And that's almost done. And that created a lot of geopolitical chaos. And we've been dealing with that, right? But like you said, if we use ISIS as a symptom, it's sort of like, okay, so that's, we're getting towards the tail end of that phase. And so Uranus moves into Taurus in May of 2018. And then it'll spend some time there, and then it'll jump back into Aries and be like, one last little thing about that kind of chaos. And then in 2019, it'll enter for good. Not for good, but for, the next 6-7 years. And so that's with the really slow moving outer planets, Uranus on out, and sometimes with Saturn and Jupiter, you'll get this thing where they'll peek into the new sign and waggle their toe around and then go back to where they've been. Right. And so we get the sort of sneak peek of Uranus and Taurus, right? It's where we have a disruption of Taurus's significations, right? Well, money, good, money, goods, commodities, actual things, right? And so things, 3D printed things, digital currencies, all this stuff is perfectly in line with Uranus and Taurus.
And when does that happen? When does it do the toe wiggle initially?
Toe wiggle starts in May.
Gotcha. All right. That is very interesting.
Yeah. And so that'll be, I always look at those as a chance to get ahead of the curve. Right. If you're like, what does it look like? Not, it's sort of like, being the one, maybe that's a theme for this podcast, right? Recognizing winter has come before you actually get snowed in, right? Yeah. And starting to adjust to where things are going.
Well, I think that is the, it's I think people are going to be forced to do that because that's what's happening in the space weather in the world, and I think there's a kind of saturnine honesty which is looking at what the books are, not what you want them to be.
Yeah,
that sort of pivot. Like you say, look, this is what it is. It doesn't matter if you like it or dislike it. These are the books.
Yeah, and so to connect the last couple years with what's coming next, I think the storyline is going to reappear, right? Because the last 2 years we've been in a state of collective narrative chaos where nobody can agree on what the story is, right? And that I think that we're going to be rediscovering the story in 2018, and it's going to be the story as told by Saturn and Capricorn, which may be a bit grim for some people, right? And that's that getting back to the books. Like, oh, well, I guess it's good to know what's going on, but that's not what I wanted.
Yeah, I still think it is better to know what's going on. But yes, I think that's that emotional pivot.
Yeah, exactly. It's that moment. But then after that, you've got I'm going to stick with winter metaphor here.
Go for it.
Like the clarity of winter. Like you go outside in the woods at winter and there's this divine silence. And it means that you can hear, you can hear the deer's footsteps 100 yards away,
And you can see the stars better.
Yeah. And so there's that clarity that comes with that season and that mode.
Great. Well, that's kind of, I like that the storyline reappears, or we find it again under its various obscurations, because it seems like other than the eclipse, the story of H1 2018 is about the slow-moving planets. Like the big stuff is slow-moving. I mean, obviously you'll get various retrograde things happening, and I guess there's Mars. But as you say, you kind of have some movement into new signs of some of the slower-moving ones. So it is in a way, because we kind of agree on this, the longer cycles are require more or deeper thinking, and we're going to get that in H1 2018.
Yeah, and I would say that they offer attuning to them offers more enduring rewards.
Yeah. Well, that's the plot. That's a great way to end it, I think, Mr. Coppock. Other than attuning to the slower moving stuff and looking at it with the cold clarity of winter, is where listeners can find the rewards. Where can they find your good self, and what do you got going on?
So let's see. My website is Austin Coppock, myname.com. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. And so actually, at the beginning of H2 of 2017, I switched from writing a weekly column to a decanly column. And so I'm putting out a rather beefy column every 10 days, sort of helping people hook into the decan and also just using that as a framework for looking, for breaking time down rather than the work week. It's an experiment. And so then I do a little paragraph on every single day, and that comes out every day. If people want to support my Patreon, they get a PDF of that, of all days of the month on the beginning of the month, the first day, or usually a couple days before that. And I've got a bunch of classes that I want to teach in 2018. I feel like I'm done with a cycle of teaching and I'm ready to do a bunch of new stuff. There'll be a lot of astrological magic stuff, a lot more sort of intermediate to advanced astrological stuff. But I'll also be teaching. I'll be teaching my sort of very thorough from the ground up foundations class too, or fundamentals class.
Nice one. That will definitely be in the show notes. Well, I look forward to these every 6 months. Sometimes it gets to about 5 months in, and I'm like, maybe we could do it at the 5 month point. And I'm like, no, no, it must be every 6 months. But I've been looking forward to this. Yeah. I've been looking forward to this. And as ever, it's super fun and super informative. And thank you very, very much. And now that you've got a tree up, Merry Christmas.
Well, thank you, and merry midsummer down there in the southern realms.
We all say it every year, but it seems so surprising that it is already time to cast our eyes up and reset the playing board for another 12 rounds. And any reset would, of course, be permanently and ruinously incomplete for any budding cycle analysts out there without an adequate understanding of the stars. And AustinCoppock.com is your one-stop space shop. And because it really is the end of the year, there'll be some slight programming changes as I, 1, head up the coast to get drunk and sunburnt with my family, and then 2, head all the way back down to the farm in the early new year. So, in lieu of a full episode for next week's show, I've prepared a video which may or may not be accompanied with a brief audio discussion. So, if you're subscribed to the blog or YouTube, you're all good. If you've just subscribed to the podcast in a, podcatcher or so on, you may have to go looking for it next Thursday. Speaking of looking for things, find us all at runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page, and find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.